All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Alicia Lord and I am with the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, and we're just helping to facilitate the webinar today. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the chat box. You can also use the raise hand feature at the bottom right of your screen in the reaction section and unmute yourself if you would like to ask your question aloud. We have two presenters today and they will be attending to the chat box to make sure all of your questions and comments are addressed. If you have entered the room as a name that is not your name, please right-click on your camera or on your picture and click rename so that we know who's speaking. And again, if you have any technical or audio issues, please let us know in the chat and we'll help you attend to those separately. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Kylen.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So today we have Kelly and Jordan with us. Kelly is a registered nurse and sexual assault examiner, forensic healthcare examiner, and currently she's serving as a forensic healthcare program manager in North Carolina. We have, Lieutenant Jordan joining us as well as the logistic program, policies and grant programs at Montgomery County Police Department. They're both joining us to provide us with a presentation on forensic interviewing. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I'm really excited to have both Jordan and Kelly with us today. Thank you so much. And I look forward to everyone's questions as we continue our presentation today.
Okay, I'm taking over now? Okay.
Sure enough, Kelly.
Okay, great. Hey, so I'm Kelly Taylor. I'm a registered nurse. So I'm just going to give this disclaimer that I might have small cat ears or maybe a paw coming up here. I have this cat that's obsessed with Zoom. And last time Jordan and I taught together, I locked him out of the room and he proceeded to rip apart my kitchen and stare at everybody on the Zoom call through a window. And there was comments everywhere. So I have tried to turn the camera off of him. He is a kitten that was born of COVID and only knows Zoom and thinks he was a part of everything. So I'm just going to put that disclaimer out there right now. So sorry. Hope he's not distracting. I hope he's a good boy today. So I want to talk to you guys about neurobiology of trauma and trauma-informed interviewing. It's one of my absolute favorite things to teach on. I hope you love it as much as I do. If you have any questions, throw them in the chat. I have tons to share with you in a small amount of time to do it because I don't want to hog all of Jordan's time because he's fabulous. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to keep this up for just 1 second. Thank you for all of those that have made this possible. Okay. So trauma-informed interactions. So this is going to be all about neurobiological responses for the reasons that people who have suffered a trauma basically respond and how oftentimes it can be misunderstood or misconstrued, and why we as a community, whether you're law enforcement, medical, social work services, regardless, advocacy, why it's really important for us to understand this so then we can have better interactions with victims of crime, and particularly the elder community. And then also how we can assist other providers who may not understand, so that we're better to so that we have not only better interviews and the process, but we also have better lifelong outcomes. So these are the learning objectives, which I basically just kind of went through, talking about how trauma affects an individual physically and also emotionally. The link between that is like holistic care for an individual. So I want to just start first with a little bit of an introduction to neurobiology. So we kind of have these hard sciences and these soft sciences. So when you think about these hard sciences, it's that fingerprint technology, DNA, it's revolutionized how we're investigating crimes. We can store evidence for so much longer. So when I collect evidence at a hospital, now we're developing cold case units because it can just be stored so much longer. But with new scientific advances, we're now changing and we're going into this whole field of soft science. neuroscience, this neurobiology, where basically we are better informed how to interact with people that are triggered by trauma, how we're conducting interviews, how we're communicating, and then also how we're perceiving victims of crime. So it's the study of how trauma affects memory and emotion and how they're linked together. It's a basis for why people present the way they do, because sometimes we'll see changes in body language. We may see changes in affect. We may see a person who has a very flat or disassociated presentation, and then they may become very hysterical, have potential triggers, anxiety attacks, and then may go back to very flat affect. So it's important to understand that that's all part of the chemicals in the brain working, and it shouldn't be misinterpreted. It can also talk about why people sometimes just don't report up front, why there also may be memory lapses and fragmented memory as well. So I tell my nurses a lot of time, if we're getting histories from patients and the memories are kind of here, there, and everywhere, and we're having to ask a lot of clarifying questions, that's a good indication that we're looking at fragmented memory. So we're going to see people that are going to present with a variety of different emotions and demeanors. That can have a lot to do with their life experiences, can have a lot to do with about how they view themselves within the community or society, how they feel about maybe the providers, law enforcement, medical, social work services that are helping them. Also, what kind of support systems do they have in their life? Are they on their own, or do they have a really good circle? So what we see with victims, especially of sexual assault, is a lot of self-doubt and a lot of self-blame and embarrassment. So that's what we see with a very young population. A lot of population of patients that I work with are kind of in that 18 to 24 age range. And so that 18 to 24 age range, is typically very exposed on social media, very comfortable with their bodies, very comfortable with terminology, and we still face self-doubt, self-blame, and embarrassment regarding a sexual assault. Now, if you look at an older, advanced population, that's going to cause additional embarrassment. If you think about a lot of the elder population, they don't use anatomically correct terms to describe genitalia or their breast. They may say down there or private parts or something like that that's more acceptable for a generation that they grew up in. They may also have a lot of embarrassment. There was a story in a forensic article about an elderly patient who reported being raped and did get medical care, and so didn't give a very thorough history of what had happened, but based on things that were said, the nurse did the forensic evidence collection kit and did vaginal swabs. That's how they investigated. It came back with absolutely zero DNA. The case was dismissed, it was dropped, and what they found out down the line was that it was actually an oral assault, an oral rape. But the woman was so embarrassed because that was something that was not acceptable and was certainly not something that was discussed in her generation, that it was completely misinterpreted and misinvestigated because there was absolutely zero discussion of oral assault and oral rape. So it's really important to understand that this causes a level of embarrassment for our population. And then if you look at elder, we have so many more barriers when it comes to embarrassment. And also how they feel about maybe their blame, self-blame. So they may also feel very uncertain with the legal system. They may not feel trusting of the process. We have come so far, and our generation understands that we have special victims units, special nurses, special law enforcement, but this was not a crime that was typically investigated. You also have to look at if it's a spousal rape. Sometimes the generations don't understand that it is possible to assault or rape a spouse. So there's lots that we have to kind of unpack so that when we're sitting down, we have to have a good frame of reference from where our patient, for me, client, whatever it may be, where they're coming from in their life. A frame of reference is extremely important. Also, fear of retaliation, fear of the attacker, medical implications, all big concerns. But what we hear across the board, regardless of age, the number one fear that people express to us is the fear of not being believed. As a nurse, this is just mind-blowing to me because I deal, and anyone in the medical community will understand this, medical community deals with big, scary issues when people are assaulted. We're taught HIV, syphilis, hepatitis, gonorrhea, chlamydia. And when patients express to us that greater than the fear of contracting HIV, they are more concerned that I won't believe them, law enforcement won't believe them, their family won't believe them. That's a ton to wrap your head around. So that's really something that we all have to consider when we're entering the room. So neuroscience and fear tells us that many common victim responses are actually the result of fear and trauma and not people trying to be deceptive. Of course, there's always going to be people that may try to deceive us, but by majority, that's not the case, and that's not what we're seeing. So it's important for us to understand that these reactions can sometimes be a product of fear and the trauma. So for the context of this briefing, trauma is going to be something that's perceived, that can be perceived as life-threatening, that they may be able to unsuccessfully protect or defend themselves. It can be something out of someone's control. It can also happen too quickly for them to process it physically or emotionally. So simply put, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events. So this is where that frame of reference comes in again. So what's traumatic to one person may not be for another. We have different life experiences. Our brains are hardwired differently. And so that's where it's really important to understand that, to get that frame of reference. I always talk about frame of reference. I think somebody on the presentation before was saying they're from the South. So this is a little shout out to my Southern girls here. So I'm from the South. So I had a patient one time tell me that she was popped upside the head. Okay, so popped upside the head, that's a very, very Southern thing. So I'm thinking popped upside the head. So I'm gonna look here, make sure that there's no, pain or when I palpate the scalp. But when I asked this person to actually demonstrate to me what had occurred, she actually took her fist and balled it up, and in the side of whatever I gave her, I can't remember what I gave her, she actually pounded 5 times. That to me, my frame of reference is not popped upside the head. And so now this is a very different scenario. This is now performing CAT scans, making sure that there's not a bleed inside the head. So sometimes even just understanding from a generational or maybe from just a different life perspective that we can have different frames of references. And it's really important to clarify that. So during a trauma, we have a couple things that are going to go on. So the catecholamines, that's the fight or flight. That's going to actually increase. That's where you can sometimes see the damage to the memory. That's what can impair the rational thought. So things will very typically in this, this period of the trauma start to be encoded with more emotional memories. Sensory memories are really important as well too, because a lot of times memories will then be attached to the 5 senses. So that's why sometimes triggers can then be a smell, a sound, something like that, because it's all very interwoven. Cortisol, which is going to be that energy that's available, that's actually going to decrease during trauma. And then opiates, which prevent pain in our body, it's kind of like a natural morphine, and that can actually last up to 96 hours in the body post-traumatic event. That actually increases in a traumatic event. So sometimes that's even why we'll see, I'm an ER nurse by trade, we'll see people walk in after a rollover car accident on a broken leg, and so some of it's adrenaline, but some of it's also these opiates that are preventing the pain in the body. So it's important to just kind of have a good frame of reference on this. So the way that trauma affects the brain is going to be the prefrontal cortex, this front part. That's where a vast majority of our information is actually going to be encoded. Sometimes when a trauma occurs, not always, sometimes this can actually shut down. It becomes very overwhelming. And then that's where we have trouble with encoding the memories. The important thing to remember about memory is the only memory that can never, ever, ever be recovered is a memory that wasn't created through maybe something like a loss of consciousness. Trauma, you still can potentially still retrieve those memories. It just is a slow process and it takes time and patience. People think that, oh my gosh, if we don't talk to victims of crime right in the moment, they're going to forget. Actually, that's not true. The memory doesn't really get worse. And so a lot of times, and I think Jordan will mention this, we're asking law enforcement to give people 2-3 days before we're sitting down and doing an in-depth interview, giving people time to let those chemicals kind of resettle Never a good idea to interview people when they're exhausted or hungry or traumatized. We need to give them time. It's also important, especially if you're dealing with an older population, it's important, do they nap typically during the day? So think about when we're talking to these folks too, do they have maybe more of a set schedule? Are they in assisted living? Are they living on their own? What does their day-to-day life look like? And being kind of respectful of what that pattern looks like. So that's important to remember. So we talk a lot about fight or flight, but what we don't discuss a lot is freeze. And that's what I want to just focus on very briefly. So during a traumatic event, a danger threat goes off, the signals, the alarms go off. That's when the amygdala takes over. And that's when sometimes those emotional memories start to take over, causing that fragmented memory. Activates the hypothalamus, blood pressure goes up, body temperature goes up, all of the oxygen goes to the muscles because those alarm bells are going off. Adrenaline starts to flood the body, and then that's sometimes when the memories can be slow to process. Sometimes this can trigger tonic immobility, which is the freeze portion that I want to talk about now. So tonic immobility is very, very frightening, and we do hear that victims of crime actually experience this more frequently than we would think. What's so frightening about it is they're completely aware of everything that's occurring, but they feel that they're unable to do anything about it. We've had victims describe this as like a quasi state of almost sleep, where they know what's happening, but they open their mouth to yell and nothing comes out. This is associated, if not properly identified by us, this can sometimes be associated with a decreased likelihood to report, decreased family support, because sometimes they'll think they don't understand freeze, that they just didn't do anything to attempt to protect themselves, scream, yell. And so you'll often hear people say, well, why didn't you yell? Or why didn't you, hit a panic alert button? Or why didn't you do this? It's not actually how freeze works. So freeze is very primitive. It's been highly studied within the animal community as, that the possum that plays dead, or, the bunny that freezes. And now they're really looking into it with humans and understanding that this is something that takes over in extremely fearful situations. So a brief story I just want to tell about this is I was teaching, this is a younger victim that I had seen, but I was teaching years ago in Maryland, and she raised her hand and asked if she could share her story of tonic immobility and why it's so important for us to clearly identify this. She had been running track and field for years, all through high school, and it was something her and her dad had done together. And on this particular day, college scouts were coming, and her dad didn't show up, and she was very concerned. And so after the run, she quickly went to the locker room to get changed, to go to the front office to use their phone to try to locate her dad. When she was in the locker room changing, her coach came in. Her coach had been sexually assaulting her for all of her 4 years of high school. She had never said anything. She had never done anything. She said, looking back, she knew what he was doing was wrong, but she didn't ever actually fear him. And she said that, so she never reported it. So while he was sexually assaulting her, she heard footsteps coming through the gym, and very quickly assessed that it was her father. She heard his voice calling her name. She had the thought that when he gets close enough, I'm going to yell his name. He's going to come in. This is all going to be over. The coach also heard the voice of her father. And so he was standing behind her. And when he heard her dad's voice, he put his hand over her mouth and nose and asphyxiating her. And she was unable to breathe. And he said, if you scream, I'll kill you. For the first time, that triggered a fear response in her. That's what made this different than every other time before. That's what triggered the freeze response, because he said he was going to kill her in combination with not feeling like she could breathe. That was a viable threat. She said she went to open her mouth to scream and nothing came out. She said she went to lift her hand to pound on the locker and it felt like it was 1,000 pounds. She said she heard the footsteps walk away and realized her dad was leaving, and the coach continued to rape her. She never told what happened. She graduated with a scholarship for track, went to college, within the first year failed out, turned to drugs and alcohol. She actually joined the military. She met her husband. About 10 years down the road, she and her husband wanted to have children. He said, he was the only person that knew about this. He said, you have got to go get some counseling before we have children, because this is something that really affects you every day. She went to counseling, carrying this with her for 10 years. She said one session with a therapist changed her whole life and set her free. They identified this as tonic immobility, as freeze. Explain this to her. She said for 10 years, she had been carrying around that subconsciously she must have liked the attention from the coach because she had an opportunity to yell for help for the person that she trusted more than anyone, and she didn't take it. And that was her misunderstanding. So we asked her, we said, did you ever tell your dad? So her dad had died 5 years previous of cancer. She said, no, I never told my dad. I loved him so much that I never wanted him to know that he was just a few feet away from me and couldn't save me. That is tonic immobility. That is 10 years of not understanding what happened, of it not clearly being diagnosed, and the long-term effects on your life. Okay, I just looked. I am already almost out of time. So I'm just going to take, Jordan, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to take like 3 minutes and just kind of get through the rest of these. Is that okay with you, Jordan?
Go forth. You're doing great.
Okay. All right. I'm going to be quick because you're going to want to hear what Jordan has to say. It's fabulous. So under stress, it's difficult for us to think clearly. All we're thinking about is that immediate survival. And that's what we were talking about just with her, with the hand over the mouth. So things that we focus on are going to be very central. Everything else is going to be peripheral. So there's no way to predict this ahead of time. So we're not able to say, you should have remembered this detail or you should have remembered that detail. It's very individualized to the person. And the central details that people focus on are the things that are going to allow them to survive. So disassociation, we see this as well sometimes. People, in an effort to cope or survive, they'll actually disassociate from the entire event that's occurring. I have seen this, especially with elder population. They will actually go to another place. They'll think about something else, a painting on the wall, a water bottle. And sometimes in getting those fine details, we can actually understand disassociation. So it's really important for us to slow down. The opposite of what I am doing during this presentation is what you should do. I have so much to tell you, but allow people time to process, active listening, empathy versus sympathy. There's Brene Brown is fabulous. If any of you guys have heard of her before, I'm quite certain you have. There's an empathy versus sympathy video that's phenomenal, 3 minutes. Definitely look it up. It explains that the difference. Empathy is what fuels connection. And so that's really important for us to understand. So filling in the gaps, if we don't tell people it's okay to not fill in the gaps, to not say, I don't know in this moment, because we understand that memories will return, that in a couple days you will have a better memory. It's okay. We don't want to force people into a yes or a no. It's okay to say unsure, because in a couple days, those answers may come to them. And then when they sit down with Jordan, they'll have those clear memories. So it's better to say unsure to me than to fill in the gap. It's natural. We all fill in the gap. So it's important to give people that permission to say they don't know. So this is what we just talked about. If we don't tell people, if we don't understand this, victims can be misinterpreted as being cavalier or lying, or, and especially with our elderly population, just being written off, just not really understanding, our older population is such a generation to be admired, and so often we see people discrediting them, and so it's really important to understand that not to cognitively dismiss them. How we respond. This is what's understanding. Rapport, not gender. So now this is rapport is a great equalizer, but it is important to understand with the older population, gender might play a factor in this. Many, older women may not feel comfortable speaking to men. So it's something, rapport goes a long way. It's just something to understand that it may take a little more time and patience to sit down, because remember, these details can be quite embarrassing. So it is important to just be cognitive of that. I put this acronym up here: BELIEVE, build rapport, eye contact, language, verbal and nonverbal. Information is only useful if it's shared. So we have to create a safe physical and emotional environment for people to feel comfortable to share with us. Empathy, that's what fuels the connection. Vulnerability. So sexual assault creates a level of vulnerability. If people do not feel comfortable with us, they are not going to volunteer to make themselves more vulnerable in speaking with us. So it's really important we understand that and empower small choices. We have to think about what it's like for people to talk to us about their experience. Yes, Jordan, you can have control of my screen. I approve you. He's like, you're out of here. It's important for them to understand that a lot are fear-driven responses and self-protection. People need to feel accepted and believed and respected. Everyone wants to be treated with dignity and respect. So keeping perspective is very important. I am going to, Jordan, you got the reins now. I'm sorry I took up some of your time.
Don't worry about it. Kelly, you're great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's super. Don't change anything on your screen because I'm using your computer.
Okay, I won't touch it.
I think, first of all, hi, everyone. Kelly, thank you very much. Like was said earlier, my name is Jordan Satinsky. I'm a lieutenant with Montgomery County PD up here in Maryland, just north of DC. Some of you might be wondering why the logistics lieutenant is actually here giving this discussion. Up until about 2 years ago, my 20+ year career was involved in either homicide, sex, elder abuse, or domestic violence. I actually created our sex assault team here in Montgomery County and actually brought together and created our MDT for our elder abuse team here in Montgomery County as well. Basically, over the next few minutes, what we're going to talk about is how trauma-informed interviewing really applies to our elder and vulnerable adult population. And this is a very unique subset of our victims. They come with, much like Kelly says, different experiences. They're from different times. Our detectives, I mean, I have some of my detectives, they're younger and, they do a lot of this. They have their phone and they're in it. I didn't, much like some of you on this call, didn't grow up that way. So we have to kind of teach them a little bit differently about how to interact with folks. Let me get this to come back up here. Why is this not? There we go. So, oops. Police overall, we're taught from birth, basically at the police academy, to hunt for the truth. That's our job. We're not therapists. We're not out there to find out exactly, how to make things better mentally or emotionally. We're there to find out what the crux of the crime was and lock up the right person. That's what we're taught basically from the academy. So how does this apply to elder vulnerable adult abuse? Well, we kind of had to change how we did things because guess what? Those victims weren't coming to us because we weren't appropriate, because we didn't know to be any different. Along comes trauma-informed interviewing and really getting a sense of how the brain works at the time when something happens, like Kelly described earlier, like a traumatic event. And all of a sudden we go, oh, that's why nobody's talking to us. We're not listening. We're not doing it exactly the right way. We have to look at this a little bit differently. So we started using Dr. Campbell's research and people like Kelly and some other folks. We started looking at different ways to interact with our elder vulnerable adult abuse population. One of those ways, we actually brought in APS and we started doing APS with us in our investigations and really teaching us how to do and what we were supposed to do and the questions we were supposed to ask and letting them actually interview the victims and letting us tag along so we could figure out what we needed to do. We came to understand that you have victims here that not only were victims of a sexual assault or some sort of a high-end crime, but also they may have other things on top of that, dementia, all sorts of other mental issues that would stop them from being able to give us all the information we would normally get from a victim that didn't have these issues. Add on top of that a sexual abuse or high-end physical abuse, you've now just totally caused all sorts of issues with how you're getting this. And to the regular cop or regular investigator, without this in this background, they're going to look at this and say, oh, she or he's not telling me the entire truth. There are holes in this story. Oh, they have a problem. When in essence, that while they may have some sort of mental deficiency, you can still get some information out of them in order to hold the correct person accountable, because it's really important to do that. Otherwise, they will continue to offend, as we all know. So as Kelly was talking about earlier, this traumatic event happens. Your brain kind of shuts off. It stops working. It kind of protects itself, goes into that fight or flight mode. And then it has what I like to call, because I work with mostly police, I try to keep it simple, Control Alt Delete. Your brain takes the time, kind of resets, and over the next 48 to 72 hours, things start to come back. But it's not always in the right order, but it doesn't change the fact pattern of what happened, such as what exactly, what they saw, what they smelled. Those things don't change. But maybe as how they're piecing it back together doesn't come back correctly. Versus someone who's not telling the truth, well, they're always telling you something like what I like to call this line. And when I go as a detective back to ask them, well, there's an inconsistency here, all of a sudden there's this other thing. There's this new piece that doesn't fit, versus someone who has this sort of memory inconsistency when it comes to being a victim, where, yeah, the pieces are coming and they're always coming the same way, sometimes in the same order, but maybe not the right order for what we would think of a crime, but it's always the same information and you'll always get more as time goes by. So one of the things we really had to do as police was retrain our brains. We had to come at this much differently. Police look at, like I said earlier, everyone has inconsistencies and we're looking for the truth. We exploit that as far as looking for the truth from the time we're young cops into the time we're homicide detectives. We had to change our brains, especially in special victims, to keeping an open mind. We had to figure out, okay, we need to let these people talk. When we do suspect interviews, we let our suspects talk for as long as they want to build that rapport. And then we switch and go into interrogator mode and go after and try to find the truth. With our victims, what do we normally do? Name, date of birth, tell me what happened. Ooh, okay, I'm not sure that actually makes any sense. And that's it, we move on to the next, because that's just how we're trained. So we need to first start with, where should this interview occur? Well, obviously, hopefully not in the office in the detective bay you're seeing where it says here. More in the area of here, on the other side, on my side of the screen. I'm sorry, it's hard to do this on Zoom, on the right, where the two people are looking right at each other in a comfortable, soft room. For APS purposes, when we go out on calls with them and we go to the hospital or the nursing homes, we actually let the APS agent go in first, kind of like what we do with CPS, and then we kind of tail in afterwards and sit and listen. We don't try to take over. We just listen to what the APS agent is talking about and we take notes from there. As we're listening to this initial interview, especially if you have someone who's mentally deficient, it can sometimes get very difficult to extrapolate the correct information in order to fill in the correct aspects of our criminal code here in Maryland. But APS agents, because we've trained with them in several instances here in Montgomery County, in how to do these interviews and what to look for, we've learned kind of what to kind of remind or ask, and vice versa, in order to kind of make that work if we feel we have enough to go forward. Not only that, we have a state's attorney that also works with us doing this exact same thing and is really wonderful. So not only have to take a different approach with this as an investigator, but add the elder vulnerable adult part of it, it's take an entirely different approach. You really have to be victim-centered. You really have to be empathetic. And you can't talk like Kelly and I are doing right now, as far as talking to a victim. You'll throw them way off. For instance, I had a serial sexual assault case that happened a bunch of years ago. I had 5+ different elderly victims that occurred over the space of 6 months. And I will tell you, the first victim I dealt with one way. The last victim was an entirely different model, which I would akin more to our trauma informed, but we didn't know about that then than I did initially, only because I learned I had to talk to these victims differently in order to find out what happened. I couldn't just come in and be just the facts. It had to be much different. So we want to let these victims talk in their own words. We don't want to fill in the blanks. It's very hard. There's that air in between when you ask a question sometimes and people want to jump in and fill that pregnant pause. Don't do that. Just let these folks talk. They will tell you. And your elderly folks sometimes will take a lot longer, which makes it very hard. So we actually have sex assault detectives that are specially trained just to do elder and vulnerable adult abuse because of that, because there's so much more involved in this subsection of the victim population. When it comes to folks in this area, I like to give them even a little bit longer time than I would normally for an adult non-elder victim, non-mentally compromised, because I want to give them that time to kind of be comfortable where they are. Some of these people may have had this assault happen in the nursing home they're in, and they may not have gone to a different nursing home, just a different room. Imagine having that thing happen to you in one place and you didn't get a chance to move. All you got to do is go a couple doors down, or some cases not move at all. So you kind of got to give them some time to process and then come in. And I've been to places more than once where I've sat down with the victim and the victim has looked at me and said, Jordan, I'm just not ready. I'm like, okay, that's fine. We'll come back. You let me know when. And, hopefully they call. But again, this is part of that victim-centered interview, and we don't want to push them too much. These will take longer, especially your older vulnerable adult. They will take longer, and investigators have to understand that. APS is great at that and keeping us on task. Now in Montgomery County, our APS, Adult Protective Services, does not only our sexual and physical, but also, from what I learned, our plethora of financial crimes, which my unit did not investigate. I found out we had about 80% financial crimes, about 20% of everything else. And I was amazed at the amount of work those folks do that have nothing to do with my side of the world. But yet, when it came to our cases, they were very, very willing to jump in and do whatever they needed to do to help us out, which is something that you really have to get from the top in order to make everyone kind of work together. I got lucky. The chief of the Adult Protective Services team and myself got our chiefs, who ran both divisions at the time, to agree to let us do this. So we weren't just making it up as we were going along, as we did for a while, and codified it. So now it's a thing that's lasted beyond us both, which is wonderful. And we get an opportunity to kind of go out and teach that around the country sometimes and show people how that actually works and the positive rates we've had of that. The victim-centered interviews, first time I ever worked with an APS agent, they were interviewing in a much different fashion than I was used to. Sure enough, what was it? The victim-centered part. I just didn't know, because we're not taught that way. They were really good about showing us how to integrate with the victim and how to integrate with their help staff as well, because you got to remember, these folks also a lot of times have numerous other people, doctors, nurses, therapists, that are helping them through all sorts of other ailments that were able to assist us in building a case against our suspect. Mirroring the language used by the victim, super important to make them comfortable. Like Kelly said earlier, if someone says down there, I go with that. Reason why? Well, I want to make sure that they understand I'm listening to them. It shows that I'm listening to them. I don't want to make things in a medical professional fashion where during my interview where they said, well, down there, and I said, oh, your vagina? No, I want to let them do that so I can let them talk, so they can feel comfortable to give me the information. I'm a stranger to them, so I want to make sure they're giving me good information so I can get the person responsible for this. Certain things that we really have to retool, and this is one of the things I really harp on quite a bit with my investigators. We are taught and spent, I will tell you, I went to class after class after class on how to identify inconsistencies in suspect statements and then turn those inconsistencies back on the suspect and basically get them to confess in the end. Point of order, I will tell you, I have a 5-year-old, and my 5-year-old is the most difficult person I've ever interrogated in my entire life. She is an expert at it. I've had homicide suspects that are very easy compared to her, but I needed to be able to take this skill set and flip it onto my victims, but without the interrogation part. That's what I always harp with my investigators. I say, listen, build that rapport, ask your open-ended questions, let them talk. You're going to get, in the elder vulnerable adult abuse world, you're going to get victims who ramble. You're going to have to let that go. Let them talk. Watch your body language. Listen to things, because in that rambling, sometimes things pop up. Scents, smells, things they saw. They will start telling you. Keep those open-ended questions. Don't do it in the initial report when you first get them in. Like I said, let them have their couple days, whatever you think is necessary or they think is necessary is the most important part before you sit down with them. Start off again, building rapport. Let the victim guide that conversation and put the victim at ease. I can't harp on that enough. Once we get into that, we want to really just gather some basic information. Make sure when you're there that the victim advocate, now in my agency, I'm lucky I have victim advocates that are specially assigned for elder vulnerable adult abuse. Not everyone has that. But if you have a victim advocate that's available, make sure they are working with them, and make sure your APS agency, if whoever you use in your jurisdiction, is also notified in order to provide whatever services they have, and make sure you're working in a tandem investigation and not separate like we used to do. I will tell you, my last homicide case, and one of the reasons why I do what I do now, or then I should say, was an elderly person who had died, and I had, and my old partner will tell you, we had relatively no contact with APS, which caused us, for a case that should have gone on for about 6 months, it went on for 3 years. And because of that case, we were able to work, kind of show both sides, my department and HHS, Health and Human Services, how we needed to work together in order to forward these cases in a different manner. And that triggered a lot of work in this area and really sped up our processes. Now I have elder abuse detectives who are running homicide investigations, which is actually pretty much unheard of in my department. In-depth investigations, you ask those open-ended questions. And this is one thing I think a lot of people miss, because there are a lot of these cases. Nobody wants to talk about them, and they're becoming a bigger deal as our society changes. If you look in the 80s, domestic violence wasn't a discussion. When I started in the 90s as a cop, domestic violence was just starting to become gauche to talk about and even come outside the house. There were still judges on the bench at the time that would say, Satinsky, that's a family problem. You're not guilty. When I started with this in elder vulnerable adult abuse, it was the same. This was a family problem. There were prosecutors, there were judges that weren't really taking it. So were my bosses that weren't taking this seriously. Eventually, that's starting to change with groups like this, which I think is fantastic. And we have to be able to understand that the survivor in this case, no matter what their mental acuity is, they need to be able to ask questions, or their power of attorney, or those folks that are working with them, so they understand where they're going. Safety planning for the 90%, in this group anyway, this victim subset is normally handled, at least for us, by Adult Protective Services, not the police department, but we will help. One of the areas that we have to be very, very careful is, as we're talking to these victims, is kind of zeroing them in when the time is right to get further information to meet the elements of the crime, because they may not be super comfortable telling you certain things. They may not know everything or feel that the information they have isn't relevant. For example, a case I worked on, the entire case was set up. I had all this good information, but I was missing parts about the suspect victim interaction to get it into court. Well, the victim, as I was going through my interview, we started talking. I was starting to ask closed-ended questions about what she heard, what she smelled. Tell me more about that smell. Do you know what that was? Well, eventually she said, yeah, it was cigarettes and it smelled like Drakkar from when I was in high school. Well, we found a potential suspect based on some witness tips and went to the guy's house, and sure enough, he smoked cigarettes and there was tons of Drakkar all over the place. That little piece of information, which she told me later, she was like, I didn't think it meant anything, was actually one of the things that really tied it all together in the end to show it, because we didn't have DNA then. But at the time when I did that case, DNA was not an option, at least for what we were doing. Much different now, but not then. When we're talking about these open-ended questions, this is formatted not exactly for elder, but you could ask, what was your interaction like when the individual came in? 90% of the time, it's a family member or it is one of their caretakers that perpetrates these crimes. What are you able to tell me about what happened once you were alone? Let them speak. They may start going down a road which has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but they will come back eventually. When we're talking about trying to get more information, we don't want to push our victims, but we do want to ask, was there anything else going on at the time? What else can you tell me about that was happening at that moment? They may have milestones in their life that they may start bringing up that make no sense to you, but you can start asking a relative or a friend, and that these things may make more sense. Like, oh yeah, that was Johnny's birthday, her ex-husband, whoever it may be, and he's deceased now, and that's why she's using that as a date. Whatever that may be, record that and how you got that. That really helps tie things together. These follow-up questions, they can be closed-ended, but just be careful, because sometimes, especially with the elder vulnerable adult population, if you get too closed, you're going to end up with weird answers. So have a good idea of what that answer may be before you ask it. When you're looking at leading questions, sometimes while they may sound odd, especially in court, I know they're not allowed there, but in our area, if you're trying to get the victim to give you some information, if they're comfortable, but you just can't give them over that little hump for whatever reason that is, leading questions may be appropriate just to kind of get them in that vein. Like, so what time was it when, you don't know what time it was when the guy came in. I understand that. Who else may have been in that room that day? Who else may have come through? Did someone come through? Any of those things that would kind of get you towards more of a timeline if you need it. Prosecutors in this world, I will tell you, I have worked with, I know from doing other cases, everything's about timelines, right? Timelines and when things happen and how things happen. In these areas, prosecutors, at least where I am, especially the specialized ones, have been really great at being able to explain why, these victims cannot always give exact timelines. These victims cannot, even sexual assault and elder abuse victims, they can't give exact timelines. They just don't know. They may not know when things happen. They may think they've been in this residential nursing home for 2 weeks, but they've been there for 5 years. That is something a defense attorney would use absolutely to strike at the credibility of the witness in certain aspects. These are things that our defense attorneys, our prosecuting attorneys can actually bring up and bring in experts to kind of show how these things, how the mind works in their dementia or whatever it may be, is working against us in those areas. And this is not a traditional investigation. Really want to recreate that reality, because in the end, it's not me that needs to know it, really. It's the victim needs to know it in order to say, maybe if they're cognitive enough, have that cognitive ability to give them some solace, or their family. But really, that judge and jury, they want to be where that happened if it goes that far. You need to be able to explain everything, all the senses, and how everything played into effect, because you're missing so many other things that an elder vulnerable adult abuse victim may bring to the table, such as that lack of exact timelines. Sexual assault in and of itself, victims have problems with exact timelines. Add in the elder vulnerable adult abuse, it's like exponentially worse sometimes. So you have to really build that case and put that judge and jury right in that area where it happened. As terrible as that sounds, you really do, in order to make an effect and hold the right people accountable. I'm just going to hold on one second. So here we're back to what I was just talking about. Here are your senses. What did you feel? How did it affect you? Some of your victims are really able to tell you this pretty spot on. I had one elderly victim. She sat there and cried while she told me everything that happened to her, and I felt terrible for her. Unfortunately, we did catch her attacker some years later, but she had already passed on at the time when that happened. She was 84. She died at 86, and Sure enough, we caught him when she would have turned 87, right around her birthday. But these things here, I was able to show the judge when we went to trial on this, all the different things she talked about and how we sketched it and outlined it. When you're writing these reports, you don't write them where you sanitize the information. You write them where what the victim told you. Just write it like you would a normal thing. Cops spend a lot of time sanitizing to make it sound like we're smarter than we really are sometimes. I'll tell you that. I'm a victim of it too, or suspect of it. But we really just need to put it in plain English, because who's going to read this in the end? Who's going to see it? The jury. And who's the only person that we're helping in the end if we don't do it right is the suspect. So we got to get it right, and we got to make sure our victim is whole and that our suspect gets put where they're supposed to be. Oops. So we really just say avoid chronological questions with this victim set population, especially as best you can. Use markers, much like, and I'm not trying to be rude by saying this, but we use the same metrics with child abuse victims. Use birthdays, anniversaries, deaths, those kind of things to kind of mark down your times. Talk about the sensory and emotional things, what they feel, what they taste, what they smell. Those are important things. Ask follow-up questions. Honesty is key, and that's honesty key from the police department, from APS agents, not just the victims. There are still cops out there, and there's still a large part of the population out there that thinks victims, sexual assault, or victims in this realm come forward and they lie about a lot of stuff. I can tell you, after interviewing, I don't even know how many victims of sexual assault over my tenure in that realm, I think I had 3 people that I can count on my hand that actually lied about it. Outside of that, the rest of it, yeah, it's this trauma-informed interviewing. It's really just neurobiology of trauma, where they didn't really understand how their brain worked and how it came back. And explaining that to them in the initial interview really does help a lot. And we just talked about this, assisting that survivor, complete a full and complete victim-centered investigation. That victim-centered investigation is letting the victim guide that as best you can, letting that victim dictate how things happen, not forcing the victim into things. Because I will tell you, one of the worst things I ever heard was a prosecutor tell me, yes, you need to get that victim into the courtroom right away. They need to come in. It was a male who had been sexually assaulted by his imam. And the male victim, he's a vulnerable adult who was in a wheelchair. And the male victim was like, I'm not coming to that. And I told the prosecutor, we're not locking up the victim to bring the victim into court to show in front of the judge for this case. That caused some issues in my office, but I wasn't doing that. That's who am I helping there? Who am I helping in the end on that one? Not the victim, not the suspect, one other person. So it's keeping your victim front and center is the best part of this whole thing. And that's really what we got to keep in mind. And folks like Kelly, myself, and this group, I know you all looking out for that. And I just hope it becomes more infectious. We see Kelly and I get to travel a lot on the SACI project, and there are a lot of good things out there, and it's becoming more infectious, but it's not there yet. It just isn't. And that's kind of, if you have questions, we'll be happy to take them now. Kelly, anybody? Are there questions about how conducting these investigations, or conducting, the SANE nurse interaction with an elder vulnerable adult victim?
Well, Jordan, I was just going to add one thing. You may have to get creative sometimes. I've known as a nurse, especially in an ER, sometimes we will see patients that maybe have had a stroke, maybe they're nonverbal, things like that. So you may have to get creative as well. You're not always going to get that verbal, explanation. So developing almost like a code with the person that you're speaking with, squeeze my hand once for yes, blink twice for no, something like that, developing a pattern. And then you'll have to formulate your questions to fit more of a yes, no. But then, annotating that, like, I asked X, for me, it would be patient blinked, indicating yes. So developing, because that's the thing is people think, not this, group that we're speaking to, but sometimes people will discredit the elderly or those that maybe have had a stroke or have some kind of cognitive impairment. But there's, you have to get creative with how you communicate with people. And then once you do, you'll get a wealth of information. It just takes the time, patience, and honestly creativity to sit down. And then there's such a mutual respect, because you realize that this population is completely capable of giving you the information you need. You just have to get out of your own comfort zone and find a creative way to communicate, maybe with a nonverbal person who's been a victim of crime. So just kind of wanted to throw that in for my nursing wheelhouse of sometimes we have, because we still need patient information from people they don't always show up by EMS with their families or a great history, but they're completely capable of communicating with us, just not in the way that we would normally think that they could.
All right, thank you so much. The presenter's contact information is on the slide. There's also a list of resources in the slide deck. We will be sending that out to everyone so you have access to that. And we've also put an evaluation for today's presentation in the chat. Please go to that and let us know how today's presentation went, what you found useful, and there's also a section for any additional topics that you may want to discuss in the future. We are going to leave the chat box open for any questions, so please feel free to stick around and enter any if you have any. And I'll turn it back over to Kylan to close it out.
Sure. I'm just reading everyone's comments in the chat box, and I just wanted to give Elsa a chance to expand on her comment about law enforcement and getting an idea of, you know, what are some of the barriers they face, and, you know, how might they be able to work with our elder population maybe a little bit better. And maybe Jordan, you can speak to this as to, you know, maybe tips for our coordinators on how to communicate to law enforcement to be able to get this information from victims for their teams.
So really, one of the things that we did in Montgomery County, I literally tried to call our APS folks because I wanted to learn more about how to interact with our elderly vulnerable adult victims. And I wasn't getting an answer because we didn't have any connections. I really wanted to create like the CPS law enforcement model where we kind of did those tandem investigations. So at that time I hadn't worn a uniform in a long time. And I just threw one on because I knew nobody stops a cop. And I walked into their building and wandered around until I literally walked into the chief administrator's office. He thought he was in trouble. And his name is Mario Wazusin. And he and I sat down and talked for about 3.5 hours. And after that, the idea was born about how to get everybody on the same page. And that is actually the link that really started to create a lot of other things, was really just getting folks together and talking and taking away that fear of, or I shouldn't even say fear, the preconceived notions. Oh, they're just a dumb cop. Oh, they're soft APS agent. Like that's really what it was. Like that, honestly, I'm not gonna lie about that. That's what both sides in the end thought. We put them both in a room and said, hash it out, let's see what happens. And as we started putting them together more and more, they started to react better. We may have sent them out on some social functions I shouldn't discuss on this call. And they started to get together more often because they had those off time activities that really did create more of a social bond, and they then started to work with one another. And once my cops saw that the APS agents weren't mad at them all the time and vice versa, they really started to gel. And actually the team over there at the APS side went from 8 to 16 investigators over the last 4 or 5 years. And the team who does elder and vulnerable adult abuse at the police department is now at about 13, I think it is. But they just don't do that. They do domestic violence and sex assault as well. But it's a great collaboration. The prosecutors have seen a lot more arrests come out. I'll tell you, when we started the year before we started this, we did 13 elder vulnerable adult abuse investigations. The year after we started it, we did 115 with a 60% arrest rate. And now for the police department, you know, we're short-sighted. Arrest rate for us is it. But in the long term, many of those people did get held accountable and did go to prison or jail, depending on what the crimes were. So we definitely did see more interaction and better ways to elicit information from your victims. But it really comes down to that collaboration. But if you work in silos, and I know it's still happening all over the place, it's not going to work. I mean, people like Kelly, if I didn't work with Kelly or the folks here at Montgomery County who do Kelly's job, I wouldn't have the information we need to move forward, and we wouldn't have that seamless transition. I would get what I used to get from my SANE nurse, 20 years ago, which was a packet of information faxed to me, because that's what we used. And it was, 20 something pages of hand scratch and type notes that I barely understood. And there wasn't any calling and going over there and asking, because they didn't talk to us. They would say HIPAA, or we can't talk to her, we're too busy. Much different now. So we have those connections, and our SANE nurses are trained that way to work with this population subset as well, and APS. So that collaboration really does build from one spot, and it's infectious and really does help in the end work with your victim in the best manner possible. Does that answer your question?
Does anyone else have any other questions?
I guess mine was less of a question, more of a comment. We have a similar model. We are the local sexual assault center and have our sexual assault nurse examiners. And we have good relationship with some of the local law enforcement, especially the larger one that has specialized DV, special victims unit. But you get some of the smaller ones that are like on the periphery of our service area. And I've recently, we had a situation where the investigator said something to the SANE nurse about basically not believing the victim because she froze or didn't fight back. And so I just feel like this information is so good. But sometimes it's the people who already have heard this stuff that will attend these trainings, and then there are the folks that haven't heard it, but they won't attend them. So that's a little bit of frustration. But yes, I think it's absolutely correct that the relationship building is very important. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks for saying that. I'm sorry that happened. I wish there was a better way, but yeah, I'm sorry that happened.
Anyone else? Well, thank you everyone for coming today. It's always nice to see people's faces and names and hear some voices. So thank you for coming out. I definitely want to show our appreciation to Jordan and Kelly for coming out today to provide us with this information. We will be sending out the slide presentation as well as a desk reference for everyone, so that way you guys can keep this at your desk and additional information and be able to utilize it for your teams. Thank you so much for coming out today. Bye.
Thank you.
Have
It was
a good
really
one.
awesome. Really appreciated it.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
Enjoy your
guys.
weekend.
See you guys.
Good seeing everybody.
See you later.
Everybody.
Bye.